Hello and welcome to Global Eye. With me, Parikshit Luthra. Respond, recognize, respect and reform. That was the highlight of Prime Minister Modi's message to 120 countries participating in the virtual Voice of Global South Summit. The two-day event kicked off on Thursday with an aim to unite southern nations, including countries in Asia, Africa and South America. Prime Minister Modi noted the importance of the southern part of the world, urging nations to amplify their voice and shaping the emerging order. He said the world is in a state of crisis and developing nations need to join hands to set the global agenda. This summit comes ahead of India hosting the crucial G20 summit later this year. While speaking about the challenges, Prime Minister informed the developing nations about the opportunities that lie ahead. He said, and I quote, "I remain optimistic that our time is coming. The need of the hour is to identify simple, scalable, sustainable solutions that can transform our societies and economies." End of quote. Let's listen in to the Prime Minister first.
We should together call for a global agenda of respond, recognize, respect and reform. Respond to the priorities of the Global South by framing an inclusive and balanced international agenda.
All right, to take this forward, we are now joined by former diplomats KC Singh and Anil Trigunayat. Thank you very much for joining us, gentlemen. Master KC Singh, give us a sense of the importance, the significance and the reason why India has tried this initiative for the first time. I'd just like to refer to some of the statements, some of the phrases used by Foreign Minister Jai Shankar. Global South sensitive, from self-centered globalization to human-centered globalization, from being on the receiving end of technological patronage to deploying global South-led innovations, from debt-creating projects to demand-driven and sustainable development cooperation. What is the importance and why did India go ahead for such an initiative?
Well, in some ways, it reminds me of the time when I joined the service, because in 1970s, 1980s, there used to be a Geneva Center for North-South Dialogue. Former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh used to head it at one stage. So this is a very old dialogue between the developing and the developed countries, from which we had been missing for a long time, and also the world had stopped paying attention to it. And then came G20, G7 morphed into G20. It was felt that these 20 important countries could take decisions. I think what's happened now is that because of the division between the permanent members of the Security Council over Ukraine war and the standoff with China, many of the old structures have become dysfunctional. Now, G20 is not going to, we saw what happened in Indonesia. Russian president was not there. There's an ongoing war. And between the epidemic, the COVID epidemic and the Ukraine war, the current ailments of the world, economic ailments, are flowing from those two events. Supply chains are interrupted. You've got inflation, food price inflation, energy inflation, and the developing countries are hit the worst. And just coincidentally, India has got the chair of G20. So Prime Minister is trying to use that position to see if there could be some dialogue again and focus back. And now one of the other thing which happened is in January, we've gone to a green hydrogen initiative of India. So last year, focus has again come back to environment. One is, of course, inflation and energy inflation. Second is how do you decarbonize? Because environment focus had gone off it for almost a couple of years and is back again on it. So as you decarbonize, as the world moves towards green hydrogen, India can sense it that you can reconstruct the engagement between the developed and the developing world. You can't again leave the developing world behind, because which are the countries benefiting from a carbon-favored economic structure? It is the developed countries and the petro-states. The developing countries are always at the receiving end. So can we transition to a more equitable order? I think that's what needs to be done. It's a highly ambitious call. Doubtful if you can do it in a year, which is what her presidency is. But it's always good to put the agenda on the table.
Right. Ambassador Trigunayat, of course, planning for an event of this magnitude would have possibly begun a few months ago. but this is not happening in person. Seems to have been decided not too far long ago. Do you think there could be any reason for thinking about such an event and trying to do it as soon as possible? Because it was only last week when the Foreign Secretary did a press conference saying that a new initiative is being announced.
Well, I think that there has been, nothing happens overnight, as simple as that. I mean, the missions would have been advised quite well in advance to find out whether the heads of the missions or heads of the governments, heads of the presidents are available or not, foreign ministers, because in every panel there is a ministerial dialogue. And therefore, this is not something that can just come out in a short time. So since India took over its G20 presidency only in December, on December 1st, so it's just about a month and a half hardly that we have passed on. And we have said that from the very beginning that India wishes to continue to be the voice of the Global South. Because this is not the first time, and as Ambassador Singh has mentioned, that we have had various meetings in the past. India has been a leader of the Global South from the time of its independence, even before that, till recently. I mean, all through, whether it is in the pandemic or otherwise. So India has always stood. But when you want to become a voice of the Global South, what happens is that you cannot presume that you know what the Global South wants. So therefore, this initiative that we must find out from those leaders exactly what is their focus so that that can be channeled into the G20 discussions. Because G20 discussions and the final outcome in the form of the declaration has to be a consensus-based document. So therefore, it is important that the key issues, everybody knows what it is, as Prime Minister Modi in his 4 hours mentioned, or the 8 priorities that have been discussed during these meetings. So they are very much there. India has been talking about it during its presidency of the presidency of the Security Council, which just ended. So I think that this has been going on for quite some time, and India is known and has shown, actually, whether it was during the pandemic or otherwise, in every which fora we talk about. So everywhere that the voice of the Global South needs to be told, focused, in a focused manner. Secondly, we need to, as Prime Minister said, that we need to escape the cycle of dependency on systems and circumstances that are not of our creation. So the decisions are taken by the Global South. If the war happens between Russia and the United States into Ukraine, then the whole world is suffering. And which countries are suffering the most? If the pandemic happens, we see the vaccine apartheid, we see the now green apartheid. So the countries that are suffering, which are the ones? It's the Global South. So they are developing countries. And as was mentioned earlier, that it is also even the environmental benefit will eventually pass on to the countries of the Global North. So therefore, it is important that you create a kind of leeway in the discussion with the developed world so that the common and differentiated responsibility principle remains on board, and whatever is required to bring the Global South onto the level is done. And that's what India is trying to do in every which fora.
Right. Okay, that's an important point. But Ambassador K.C. Singh, let's just talk about the influence of China in continents, in nations which comprise the Global South, Asia, Africa, South America. What are China's stakes here, and how is India trying to counter the influence of China? One important point that strikes me is the issue of mounting debt. How important is this in the context of what India is trying to do?
See, in that, China's both can provide a solution, but is also part of the problem. 2 other countries facing economic distress in South Asia. We've seen the economic meltdown in Sri Lanka, largely engendered by the Chinese contribution to their debt and building infrastructure which has been non-productive. Same is the case with Pakistan, and Pakistan is just on the verge of economic collapse. And there is, of course, political collapse. So there is this issue, and that is the problem, that because of the divergence of interest between China and India, there's convergence and there's divergence on some issues, on issues of environment, global trade remaining open, etc. New conditionalities not being put, non-tariff barriers not being imposed. China and Indian interests are convergent. But then they're divergent in this. The army chiefs just said a day ago that we are finding more troops moved to the northeastern line of actual control across from Arunachal Pradesh. So if China is going to be doing this, that territorially in the maritime boundaries as well as on the continent is going to be asserting itself and behaving aggressively, then it hardly remains a partner. How do you? And there is, of course, the common sense understanding that the Chinese would not want India to assume global leadership. They want to contain India and leave India to a South Asian subsector. So through this G20 chairmanship, India is assuming leadership. Don't forget that Prime Minister Nehru was a very predominant leader in the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s, as much of a standing or greater acceptability than Mao had. And then came the 62 war. So the Chinese have multiple factors, and one of them is keeping India constrained. Whereas India, by saying we are assuming the leadership of the global South, it's trying to, and that's why Chinese, when they got involved with G77, they never joined it. They said the group began to be called G77 plus China. They said we don't want to be in that group. That is a group of the developing countries, which became more than 77. It became 100 and something. But the Chinese have this habit of saying that we are now more under President Xi Jinping than ever. They want to be a pole. They want to be considered an equal of the United States. And in this competition, space for India to be determining the agenda and playing the arbiter is, I think, limited.
Okay. 120 countries participating. How do you think, Ambassador Trigunayat, is the Ukraine-Russia war driving this strategy? One of the problems that everyone has seen over the last 1 year is food and energy prices, high volatility there, fertilizer shortage impacting the agricultural sector across developing nations. Give us a sense of how the war is driving India's strategy, and can there be some consensus on supply chains?
Well, I think that these 3F crises that you mentioned, which has come out essentially out of the Russia-Ukraine war, and as I mentioned earlier, has basically impacted a great deal the countries in the global South, because they are dependent on these imports, whether it is food, whether it is fuel, or fertilizer for that matter. And therefore, the politicization or weaponization of these instruments has really done a great harm to the world. And that's one thing that India has in its G20 agenda, is how to depoliticize or this globalization which is happening, how to contain that. That is something extremely important. So that these issues are basically the essentials are kept out of it. So Russia-Ukraine war, as you know, that nearly it's stymied the Indonesian presidency, where India did play a role in bringing out some kind of a Bali declaration with some references. And this continues to remain a challenge because this war is not ending right now, we have seen, and it is unlikely to end so soon. So therefore, the problem for India is how it is going to contain the bad effects of the war in the first place, and can it play some kind of a role in bringing about the two sides to the table. Now, whether Russia and Ukraine agree eventually out of fatigue, out of going out of weapon systems or whatever it is, somehow, if it stops, then it makes India's case a little bit better. But if the war continues and the situation continues to be there, the other countries are all involved. Global, we are looking at the recession in the Western countries. We are also looking at the world heading towards a Cold War 2.0 kind of situation. And therefore, I think that what India can eventually get is being a voice of the Global South means what we did during the time of the NAM. We could perhaps, as I always say, emerge as the leader of the nations for a strategic autonomy.
All right, we've run out of time, but Ambassador Trigunayat, Ambassador KC Singh, thank you very much for joining us, putting the Voice of the Global South Summit in perspective for our viewers. On that note, we will take a short break, but don't go anywhere. India and the United States have ruled out a mini trade deal agreement between the two nations in the near future. A special discussion with Atul Kashyap, President at US-India Business Council. Stay tuned. Now, shifting focus to the India-US trade ties, Union Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal and US Trade Representative Catherine Tai held bilateral trade talks in Washington on Wednesday. Both countries ruled out a mini-trade deal or a free trade agreement between the two nations in the near future. However, Piyush Goyal said that India and United States are thinking big when it comes to their trade relationship. Both sides have formed a forum on resilient trade, and Piyush Goyal also took up the issue of delay in business visas. I spoke to Atul Kashyap, former US diplomat and president of the US-India Business Council, began by asking him if it's a good idea to put off a trade deal and whether there should be more ambition in the US-India trade partnership.
I just hosted Minister Goyal in New York City with our board and our members. The optimism in the room was fantastic. Everybody sees India's growth trajectory. They know that India's GDP is going to rise by multiples. And the challenge, I think, the responsibility of both of our governments is to capture that potential to the fullest for both of our citizens, 1.7 billion citizens, and to uplift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So we have to get it done, and we must be more ambitious.
Right. Talking about some of the outstanding issues in the trade relationship right now from the US side, what would those be?
I think that we are facing an enormously turbulent geostrategic picture. And one thing that really strikes me is that both of our officials, both sets of officials, when they talk to me, talk about trust. Frankly, we trust each other. And that is the glue that is going to carry us forward. So whatever the issues are in the trade relationship, I put them within the much larger frame of the world's two greatest democracies working with each other to unleash human potential across the century, leverage what is going to be India's unbelievable rise in this century, and transform the entire world to make humanity healthier, happier, and frankly, as free as our two countries enjoy right now. So there are many different issues that need to be addressed, but I think we're addressing them in the spirit of partnership and friendship, and above all things, trust.
Coming back to the issue of more ambition for a trade partnership between both India and the United States, why do you think the trade deal lost momentum? And is there disappointment among businesses that this trade deal is no longer being discussed?
Neither in your country nor in my country is there any king who can wave his hand and we can have a trade deal. Ours are layered, complex, pluralistic, free societies. The people have to be at the point where these trade deals can go forward. They are massively complicated. They have huge implications for both your country and ours. It is my sincere hope and prayer that our countries will achieve a free trade agreement. But short of that, given the politics that we have to face every day, there are areas and dimensions of low-hanging fruit that we should take care of and address as friends in the Trade Policy Forum. Get those out of the way, maybe have a digital services agreement, maybe have MOUs on various elements of critical and emerging technology, maybe work on supply chain issues, especially as we face, the challenges post-pandemic of ensuring resilient and secure supply chains. Get that done, and over time the politics will get to the point where a free trade agreement is easily done.
Right. One final question on the trade aspect before we move on. Why do you think there is some sort of lack of momentum within the United States or lack of appetite for trade deals at the moment? It's not just India, but there seems to be an overall lack of appetite for trade deals.
Look, I'm overseas right now, and as a patriot, the rule, and as a diplomat, the rule is you don't talk about politics back home. But you know how it is. I mean, our politics are tough. Trade deals require a pretty heavy consensus across both parties, and it's just not the moment, right? But I do give the administration credit for having the Trade Policy Forum. India is in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is very important. India is our trusted and valued Quad partner. We do more things with India today than I could have even dreamed of 20 years ago.
There was an important announcement during the visit of Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal after his meeting with the USTR Catherine Tai about setting up a forum on resilient trade. How important is this for the two countries?
It's extremely important. The pandemic taught both India and the United States some very harsh lessons. And I think both of our governments have learned those lessons, and they are going to look at supply chains. They're going to look at where there are issues in terms of being able to ensure resilient and secure supply of necessary items for the happiness and well-being of our people, and they're going to address it. And they're also going to look at the trade facilitation required to make ease of commerce between our countries that much better. As Quad partners, we have a special responsibility to ourselves, to the Indo-Pacific, frankly, to the entire world. So I think it's a great initiative, and I wish them great success.
The Ukraine-Russia war, it's almost completing a year now. How has that impacted the trajectory of US-India business and economic ties?
I would say that it reveals something very important between us. We worked through this. When I say we, I mean the US and India. We worked through this in a respectful, constructive manner that indicates the amount of appreciation we have for each other and, frankly, the strategic convergence between our countries. There were public disagreements, in op-eds and in the media, but privately our governments worked very hard to reassure each other of our global strategic and economic imperatives. And so when you look at when Secretary Yellen came here in November, she talked about India as a friend-shoring destination. And this, my friend, goes back to the element of trust. The most important thing in a relationship.
You speak about friend-shoring. How would India and US, and how would the business chambers between both the countries work on realizing this goal of friend-shoring? Is that a strong agenda, big agenda item for the US government? There's going to be several engagements between India and US at the highest level. Are we going to see some sort of policies in order to operationalize this thought on friend-shoring?
If you recall, when we last spoke, I talked about high-trust ecosystems, and I talked about a free world supply chain. Those conversations happen in public sometimes, but they also happen in private. And I'm very glad that both countries are now looking at the issue of friend-shoring. Obviously, Prime Minister Modi's government has been very keen on attracting investment into India. And I think our companies and Indian companies are realizing the potential of diversifying their supply chains in a way that ensures that our citizens always have the things we need, even in an extreme scenario. So to answer your question, USIBC, our professional staff in India and in the United States, part of the United States Chamber, myself and all my colleagues unceasingly work every day on thought leadership and advocacy. We don't do it for ourselves necessarily, we do it for the two countries and for their well-being. So when we start to talk about friend-shoring, it's because our member companies, our professional staff realize that, and then we put forward ideas in a respectful and constructive way to help our peoples.
I'd like to ask you about US-India trade this year. We're looking at a global slowdown, and that slowdown is impacting the United States as well. Do you think the import of Indian goods into the United States is going to see a dip this year, probably a sharp dip?
I'm not sure that's going to happen. If you look at job creation in the United States, we've had a great year in job creation, or last year in job creation. Inflation certainly hit us the way it hit you due to the war. Mr. Putin's war put a shock through the entire system. But when I look at what's happening in the States, consumer confidence is a little guarded, but I'm not necessarily certain it's going to impact Indian imports.
Talking about areas where you would be seeking greater exports, greater market access in India this year, what would be those key sectors be?
We want a level playing field. We want to be able to compete on par and bring the highest levels of ethics, managerial capability, technology, business know-how to bringing good products at good prices to the Indian people and the broadest possible selection. In a way, this is business's service to the rise of India as a healthy, happy, prosperous country. A colossus in world affairs is the potential that lies imminently in India's future. And if India's people are healthy and happy, they have access to the world of consumer goods, services, then that's good for them. I would say level playing field, ease of doing business, transparency, predictability of regulations. The Prime Minister himself the other day talked about clearing out some of the thicket of regulations that have a long legacy behind them that need to be removed in order for business really to boom in this country. I do think and I share the vision that India could be a $30 trillion economy.
All right, there will be several high-level engagements between India and US in this year. That's all we have time for. Thank you for watching and goodbye.